"This house will be yours one day," my parents said as they handed me the keys. I believed them. For 5 years, I paid their mortgage every grueling month, every check that ate away at my savings. I thought I was building my future. Then came my sister Lily's wedding. A perfect day, filled with flowers and laughter. And then, the announcement. My parents stood tall, smiling like proud royalty, and declared, "We are giving our house to Lily and her new husband as their wedding gift." My world stopped. That was the house I'd been paying for, the house they had promised me. Lily knew. She smiled through her tears, clutching the deed I'd bled for. But the betrayal didn't end there. Weeks later, my parents demanded my vacation home, the one I had bought with my own money. "It's only fair," they said. "You already have enough." That was the moment I snapped. "No, this is mine." And when they tried to take it anyway, the police came. And the truth finally burned its way out for everyone to see. My name is Claire. When all of this first began, I was 29 years old, working as a marketing coordinator at a mid-sized firm in the city. I lived in a modest apartment with my boyfriend. We weren't rich, but we worked hard for every bit we had. I had always been the dependable one, the person others leaned on, and although that made me proud, I never imagined that this very quality would pull me into a choice that would define the next 5 years of my life. It started one evening when my parents came to see me, unannounced. My father carried an envelope stuffed with unopened bills, his posture weighed down as though life had chipped away at him. My mother followed, her hands stiff and twisted from arthritis, her movements hesitant. They didn't have to speak for me to sense the storm that hovered over them. We sat together at my kitchen table. Dad cleared his throat, struggling with words that seemed too heavy to say out loud. "Claire, we're falling behind," he admitted. His voice was low, almost defeated. He told me his hours at the plant had been cut again, and with the smaller paycheck, the mortgage payments were slipping out of reach. My mother explained she could no longer handle the clinic shifts she used to take. Her body simply wouldn't allow it. They tried to hold things together, but the bank had already started sending warnings. Then came the words that locked me into their burden. My mother leaned forward, her eyes glassy, her voice trembling. "One day, this house will be yours. We can't keep it without your help, but if you step in, it will all come back to you. We promise." That single sentence landed with all the weight of trust, duty, and something deeper, a rare moment where I felt I mattered as much as Emily, my younger sister, who had always been the center of their world. For once, their eyes were on me, their hope pinned to me. After years of being overshadowed, this was my chance to prove myself, to secure not just their house, but also my place in their pride. I told them yes. Without hesitation, I agreed to take over the mortgage. I convinced myself it wasn't just an act of rescue, it was an investment in my own future. I told myself I could sacrifice vacations, dinners out, and new clothes. I would skip luxuries and keep driving my aging sedan if it meant protecting the home I grew up in. I believed their words, believed that this house would one day be mine. The first payment I made filled me with pride. I remember calling the bank, giving my details, and when the transaction went through, a wave of relief washed over me. My parents were effusive with their gratitude. "We don't know what we'd do without you," Dad said. Mom kissed my cheek and whispered, "You're saving us." Those words felt like gold, rare and shining. I held on to them, like treasures. Month after month, I kept paying. Some months were harder than others, but I never missed. I tracked every penny, trimmed every expense. David, who was still my boyfriend at the time, asked gently if I thought it was fair. I answered with the same certainty every time. "It's worth it. They promised me the house. This isn't just helping them, it's securing our future." Sacrifices piled up. Friends traveled abroad while I stayed home. Coworkers upgraded their cars while I clung to mine. But each check I sent to the bank felt like a brick in the foundation of the life I was building. When I visited my parents, I saw small changes: a new sofa, fresh paint, small renovations. They always tied it back to me. "This house is looking good again, thanks to you," Mom would say, and my chest would swell with pride. Yet doubt slipped in during quiet nights. I would lie awake wondering why it was always me carrying the load. Emily was out traveling with her boyfriend, her life a carousel of vacations and carefree adventures. I wondered if my parents had ever asked her to contribute. If they had, I never saw any sign of it. She lived untouched by responsibility, while I was buried in it. Still, every time doubt threatened to grow too loud, I repeated their promise to myself. One day, this house will be yours. I believed it because I needed to, and so I kept paying. By the time 5 years had passed, I had funneled tens of thousands into that mortgage. It became routine, like breathing. I told myself I was securing not just a house, but a place in the family, proving I was more than the daughter they often overlooked. I thought I was earning their pride, their love, and finally, the home they said would be mine. But looking back now, I see that promise for what it truly was, the opening act of a betrayal I couldn't yet imagine. Every dollar, every sacrifice, every choice I made was setting the stage for a story that would shatter everything I thought I knew about family and trust. Looking back on those 5 years of mortgage payments, I can see now that they were not just about money, but about something deeper I had carried with me since childhood. The promise of the house seemed to stand as a correction for all the times I had been overlooked, all the moments when Emily had been the one bathed in praise while I stood quietly to the side. At the time, I didn't name it as favoritism, but that's exactly what it was. And it shaped how I received my parents' vow that one day the house would belong to me. I remember the day I graduated from college. I had worked nights and weekends, juggling classes and part-time jobs to make it through. I walked across the stage in my cap and gown, heart pounding with pride. My parents came, sat politely in the crowd, and afterwards gave me a card with a $50 bill tucked inside. It was not nothing, but it was small, a gesture that felt like checking a box rather than celebrating a milestone. 2 years later, when Emily graduated, my parents gave her the keys to a shiny used car parked outside the ceremony hall. I was there when she squealed with delight, hugging them as if they had handed her the moon. They beamed, their pride spilling over, and I stood off to the side, clapping but trying to ignore the sting in my chest. That was not the only time. For my 21st birthday, I had planned a dinner out with friends and invited my parents. They promised they would come, but at the last minute, they called to say Emily had a volleyball game and they couldn't miss it. It wasn't a championship, just a regular match, but they chose her over me. I blew out candles that night without them, telling myself it didn't matter, but it did. Years later, when Emily turned 21, they rented out a banquet room, invited family, friends, even neighbors. They toasted her with speeches about how bright her future was. I smiled through the party, but inside I felt hollow. These patterns repeated again and again. School concerts I played in, they were absent. Emily's choir performances, they sat in the front row with flowers. My achievements earned polite nods. Hers earned loud applause. If I complained, I was told not to be jealous, that they loved us both equally, but it never felt equal. Even as an adult, when I landed my first serious job, they gave me a handshake and a quick, "good for you." When Emily got her first job, they bragged about it for weeks to anyone who would listen. I carried these memories quietly, letting them settle deep inside me. I convinced myself that was just how things were, that some families had favorites and I happened not to be one. It hurt, but I built a life around the idea that if I worked harder, proved myself, maybe one day they would see me too. That is why when they promised the house, I clung to it like a lifeline. It wasn't just about walls and a roof. It was about fairness, about balance. It was about finally receiving something that felt like recognition, something tangible to offset the years of being the lesser daughter. David noticed how often my stories about growing up circled back to Emily being chosen first. He once asked me if it ever stopped bothering me. I told him I was used to it. That was the truth. I had grown accustomed to being second place, the reliable one in the background. What kept me steady was the thought that their promise of the house was proof things could change, that at least once, I would come first. I needed to believe that, because without that belief, I would have seen the mortgage payments as nothing but a chain holding me down. Over time, I even began to reinterpret those painful memories through the lens of the promise. The birthday dinner they skipped, the graduation they downplayed, the endless bragging about Emily. I told myself it didn't matter anymore. One day, I would inherit the house, the symbol of our family. That would be the moment when the scales finally tipped, when my sacrifices were acknowledged. The truth was that the favoritism had trained me to accept less, to settle for scraps of recognition, and to call it enough. That conditioning made their promise of the house sound larger than life. To someone who had always been overlooked, the idea of being trusted with something so central felt monumental. I ignored the voice deep inside warning me that history tends to repeat itself. I wanted so badly for this to be different that I convinced myself it was. So I worked, I paid, and I carried those old wounds like invisible weights. Each check to the bank was more than money. It was a silent plea that perhaps this time I would not be forgotten. I didn't say it out loud, but the truth was simple. The house was not just a house to me. It was proof I mattered. And because I believed in that proof, I let myself hope. I let myself trust. I convinced myself that the favoritism of the past was over, that this promise was the bridge to a new kind of future. I could not have known then how wrong I was, or how the old patterns would twist themselves into the deepest betrayal I had ever faced. As the years of mortgage payments piled up, and the promise of the house became a quiet anchor in my heart, life moved forward in other ways too. Emily grew older, finished college, and eventually announced she was getting married. The news was delivered over Sunday dinner, with my parents glowing as though the sun itself had chosen to shine only on her. I smiled politely, offered my congratulations, and kept my thoughts to myself. Deep down, I felt a twinge of unease. Her big day was fast approaching, and I knew from experience how my parents would throw themselves into her celebration in a way they had never done for me. Still, I wanted to be supportive. Emily was my sister, after all, and despite the years of favoritism I had endured, I believed family deserved generosity. When David and I sat down with her and her fiancé to talk about the wedding expenses, it quickly became clear that their budget had outpaced their means. Without hesitating, David slipped his hand over mine and said we would contribute. We decided on a gift of $10,000, a wedding present that would give them a strong start. On top of that, we agreed to cover nearly a third of the entire event's costs. It was a staggering sum, but between David's steady job and my position at the firm, we could afford it. More importantly, I thought it would show that I was invested in Emily's happiness, in her future, and in keeping the family close. The weeks leading up to the wedding were filled with planning and activity. My parents seemed to live and breathe for the event. They spent hours talking about the decorations, the venue, the food, and of course, Emily's gown. Every time I visited, they seemed years younger, buzzing with excitement. The house that had once been weighed down by overdue bills was now alive, with talk of flowers, menus, and guest lists. I watched them with a quiet ache, remembering my own wedding 5 years earlier. My parents had been present, certainly, but not like this. At my wedding, they were polite, supportive in the most surface-level way. They smiled, they posed for photos, but they did not radiate joy the way they did now. As the wedding day drew near, the contrast became harder to ignore. They had been pleasant at mine, yes, but not exuberant, not overflowing with pride. With Emily, every step was a triumph, every detail a cause for celebration. When the rehearsal dinner came, I sat across the table from them and watched their faces glow with pride as Emily and her fiancé practiced their vows. My mother's eyes shimmered with tears. My father's chest swelled with a pride that almost looked youthful. It was as if Emily had brought them back to life. I told myself not to dwell on it, not to compare, but the feeling gnawed at me. On the morning of the wedding, David and I drove to the venue with our envelope tucked safely away. Inside was the $10,000, crisp bills that represented months of saving and careful planning. It was meant to be our formal gift to Emily and her new husband, on top of the larger contribution we had already made behind the scenes. I should have felt proud, generous, maybe even excited. Instead, a strange tension clung to me, as though some unseen weight pressed on my chest. The venue itself was grand, filled with flowers and music, laughter spilling into every corner. Guests arrived dressed in their finest, and the air was thick with anticipation. I tried to let the joy carry me, to lose myself in the celebration, but every time I glanced at my parents, I was reminded of how different things had been for me. They moved through the room like royalty, glowing, greeting guests with beaming smiles. My mother fussed with my father's tie, and he pretended to be annoyed, though his grin betrayed him. They looked radiant, younger, almost transformed. I remembered standing beside them on my wedding day. They had looked proud, of course, but not like this. Not with this light in their eyes, not with this infectious joy that seemed to spread to everyone around them. It was impossible not to notice. The contrast between what I had received and what Emily was being given was stark, and I couldn't shake the quiet sting it left behind. When Emily walked down the aisle, my parents clutched each other's hands, their eyes locked on her as though she were the most extraordinary bride in the... I forced myself to smile, to clap, to nod at the right moments, but inside I felt like I was standing in a play I hadn't been invited to star in. The vows were said, the rings exchanged, and the guests erupted in applause. Emily and her new husband kissed, sealing the start of their life together. The reception was a swirl of food, dancing, and speeches. Laughter echoed through the hall, glasses clinked, and joy filled the air. Yet even as I moved through the crowd, shaking hands and making small talk, I could not shake the sense that something loomed ahead. It was as though the entire evening was building toward a moment no one could see coming. Every smile, every toast, every step on the dance floor felt like the prelude to an announcement that would crack the night open. I caught David watching me from across the room, his eyes narrowing in quiet concern. He could sense it too, that odd, unsettled current beneath the celebration. It was more than just old wounds or quiet comparisons. Something was brewing. I didn't know what, but I could feel it. The night was too perfect, too carefully constructed, and in my bones I knew that perfection never lasted long in our family. Something was coming, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same. The sense that something was building didn't leave me as the band quieted and silverware chimed against glass. The room softened into that attentive hush that means a speech is coming. David's hand found mine under the table, a small anchor, and I managed a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. The MC introduced the maid of honor, then the best man. Their toasts were the usual blend of stories and laughter, the kind that makes a room feel warmer. But even as everyone laughed, I could feel the current shifting. My mother touched my father's sleeve and stood, smoothing an invisible crease on her dress. My father rose with her, his face lit with a pride I hadn't seen since I was a child. The MC stepped back. My parents faced the room together, shoulder to shoulder, as if this were their moment as much as Emily's. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate our daughter," my mother began, her voice bright and steady. "It has been such a joy to watch her grow into the woman she is today." My father nodded, taking the microphone as if they had rehearsed this handoff a dozen times. "We could not be prouder of Emily and of the wonderful man she married today," he said. Around me I heard soft sighs, the rustle of napkins lifted to dab at eyes. It should have been a simple, sentimental offering. But then my mother reached into her clutch and pulled out a slim folder, the kind you use for important papers. My skin prickled. "As parents, we want to give a gift that truly sets them on their way," my mother said, and my father's smile widened. I felt my chest tighten. My mother looked at Emily and her new husband with a tenderness so open it almost felt theatrical. Then she said it, clear and ringing over the sound system so there could be no mistaking the words. "We are giving our house to Emily as a wedding gift." For a heartbeat, the room was stunned, silent. Then applause cracked like thunder. People stood. Some whistled. Chairs scraped back as guests surged to their feet in delighted surprise. Someone behind me said, "Oh my goodness," like a prayer. Emily covered her mouth with her hand and began to cry big, wet tears, except there was no shock in her face. Her eyes brimmed, yes, but her breath didn't catch. She didn't look around for confirmation. She didn't look to her husband in disbelief. Instead, she rose gracefully as if answering a cue, dabbed at the corners of her eyes with a neatly folded tissue she'd already had in her palm, and walked into my parents' open arms. I could not move. The air left my lungs in a slow, hollowed-out way, as if something had punched me without touching me. The words echoed in my head with perfect clarity, each one striking a different part of me. "We are giving our house to Emily." The house I had helped keep standing. The house I had pictured as the place I would someday bring my own children to for holidays. The applause seemed to come from far away. My fingers had gone numb in David's grip. He tightened his hold, as if sensing the cold moving through me. My father took the folder from my mother and held it up like proof. "We wanted to make this official today," he said, his voice warm and full. "We couldn't be happier to pass on a home filled with memories to our daughter as she starts this new chapter." Their faces were radiant. They basked in the room's approval the way people bask in sunlight. Guests turned to each other, nodding, murmuring about what a generous, beautiful gesture it was. I heard words like remarkable and what a blessing and so generous. My mother extended the folder to Emily, and there it was again, the fluidity, the lack of surprise. Emily didn't hesitate. She reached for it without looking to her husband for permission or to anyone else for explanation. He laughed, open-mouthed and dazzled, but she wasn't surprised. She tucked the folder to her chest and turned back to the room with tears slipping down her cheeks in perfect, camera-ready lines. David squeezed my hand hard enough to bring me back into my body. I felt my jaw clamp shut. I tried to stand but couldn't. I was pinned to my chair by the weight of understanding that slid into place with a sickening click. This wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't a burst of generous inspiration. It was prepared. It was planned. My sister's hand had been ready with a tissue. My mother's words flowed without a stutter. My father had the papers at the exact moment the room was quiet. The MC hadn't scrambled. He stepped aside, like he knew it was coming. And my parents smiled at Emily, the way people smile, at a performance that has gone exactly as rehearsed. I heard my own heartbeat in my ears, loud and insistent. In that beat, I remembered the envelopes I had sent to the bank, the nights I had stayed in when others went out, the times I had told myself that one day, "This house will be yours." I thought of my mother's eyes when she said it, how sincere she had looked, and wondered if I had mistaken sincerity for convenience. Because if this moment had been prepared, if Emily had known, if my parents had known, then what was all that talk about someday to me? Fuel. A promise extended like a carrot to keep me moving in the direction they needed. The applause began to fade into the hum of the room returning to motion. My mother kissed Emily's cheek. My father shook her husband's hand. Friends rushed forward to hug them, congratulate them, tell them how lucky they were. I sat very still and watched my family from a distance of 10 feet that felt like 1,000. Emily's husband glanced my way with a wide smile that faltered when he saw my face. He looked quickly away. Emily didn't look at me at all. David leaned in so close, his breath warmed my ear. "Claire," he said softly, "breathe." I realized I had been holding my breath, trying to keep the room from spinning. I inhaled slowly, tasting bitterness at the back of my throat. I told myself to blink, to swallow, to do something, so I wouldn't dissolve into tears in the middle of that room. I managed to nod. My mother, still holding the microphone, finally addressed the guests again with a laugh that sounded almost girlish. "Let's celebrate our newlyweds," she said, and the band started up as if on cue, the first bright notes of a song that clashed hard against the dull roar inside my head. I stood then, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't bear to let anyone see me crumble. People filtered past, clapping me on the shoulder, as if I too were part of the happy surprise. I found my smile, the practiced one that didn't show any teeth, and used it like a shield. The floor felt unsteady under my feet. From across the room, My parents looked over the crowd as if they were kings surveying a well-ruled court. Their eyes passed right over me. When Emily finally looked my way, it was brief and careful, the look of someone checking a box. She lifted the folder slightly, a tiny motion of triumph disguised as gratitude, and then turned away as a photographer called her name. That small, deliberate motion told me everything I needed to know. There had been no surprise for her tonight. Only a presentation. Only a gift perfectly arranged and delivered. The realization slid under my skin and settled there, cold and sharp. David's hand was at my back now, steady and firm. "We can leave whenever you want," he murmured. I nodded again, not trusting my voice. Around us, the party swelled back to life. Laughter rose. Glasses clinked. The dance floor filled. And in the middle of all that celebration, I stood very still and understood, finally, that the world I thought I knew had been quietly rearranged without me. David's hand was firm at the small of my back as we slipped quietly out of the reception hall. The music was swelling again, laughter spilling out into the corridor, but it all seemed muffled, as if I had been submerged underwater. We murmured apologies to a few guests on the way out, something about an early meeting, exhaustion from the long day. No one pressed. Why would they? The party was still blazing behind us, and Emily was at the center of it all, radiant and adored. The heavy door swung shut behind us, and in the silence of the parking lot, the weight I had been holding inside shattered. Tears came hot and fast before I could even get the car door open. David drove without saying a word, one hand steady on the wheel, the other clasping mine so tightly it was as if he could keep me from unraveling entirely. The city lights blurred into streaks through my wet lashes. Every blink brought back the image of my parents beaming at Emily, of the papers raised high like a prize, of the applause rolling through the hall like thunder while I sat frozen in my chair. My chest felt hollow and burning all at once. The betrayal wasn't only about the house. It was about years of being less, of being overlooked, of being told without words that my sister was the one who mattered more. Tonight had been the confirmation written in bold, in front of everyone we knew. When we reached home, I barely made it through the door before I collapsed onto the couch. David sat beside me and pulled me against him, his shirt dampening as the sobs tore loose. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes ached. It wasn't just grief, it was humiliation, rage, and the deep ache of realizing that the people who had sworn to protect me had cast me aside as though my sacrifices meant nothing. The house, the mortgage payments, the trust I had built around their promise, it had all been tossed into Emily's lap, as though I had been nothing more than a placeholder. "I don't understand," I choked out between sobs. "I did everything they asked. I gave up so much. They told me it was mine. How could they do this? How could she stand there and act like it was a surprise when she knew all along?" My voice broke on the last word, bitterness coating my tongue. David's hand stroked my hair, his voice low but firm. "Because they don't see what I see. They don't see the woman who has carried this family, who kept that house standing when it would have fallen apart without you. They've never valued you the way they should. But I do, and I always will." The steadiness in his tone anchored me. His words didn't erase the pain, but they gave me something solid to cling to in the storm. I curled against him, still trembling, and whispered, "It's like I was invisible, like I don't matter at all." "You matter to me," he said fiercely, pulling back just enough so I would meet his eyes. "More than anyone. And I promise you this, we are not going to let them walk all over you. Not this time. They crossed a line tonight. They think you'll stay quiet, that you'll swallow it the way you've swallowed all the other slights. But they don't know you like I do. They don't know what you're capable of when you've been pushed too far." His conviction burned into me, planting a seed in the ashes of my despair. The tears kept coming, silent now, sliding down my cheeks as I thought of the years I had been overlooked. Graduation, birthdays, milestones, all overshadowed by Emily's spotlight. Tonight was supposed to be about her, yes, but it had turned into something else entirely. It had become the night my parents declared, publicly and proudly, that their promises to me were disposable. I lay awake long after David drifted into sleep beside me. My body was exhausted, but my mind replayed every detail. My mother's voice ringing over the speakers, my father's triumphant smile. The folder, the applause, Emily's calculated tears. Each memory landed like a blow, until the ache in my chest throbbed so heavily, I thought it might never ease. In the dark, I clutched the blanket and let the silent tears fall, soaking into the fabric. I thought about walking away completely, cutting ties and never looking back. But even through the grief, a spark of something sharper flickered. It wasn't enough to cry. It wasn't enough to hurt quietly in the shadows while they painted themselves as generous heroes. There would have to be a reckoning. David stirred and pulled me closer, half asleep but still protective, his arm draped over me like a shield. I pressed my face into his chest and breathed in the steady rhythm of his heart. For tonight, I let myself grieve. Tomorrow would come soon enough. Tomorrow, I would face the reality of what had been stolen from me. But tonight, in the cocoon of our home, I let the tears fall until my body had nothing left to give, while David's whispered promise lingered in my ears. He would stand beside me, no matter how ugly the fight became. The week after the wedding stretched out in uneasy silence. My phone stayed dark, though I knew it was only a matter of time before my parents reached out. David urged me to block them, to give myself breathing room, but some stubborn part of me wanted to see what they would do next. When the call finally came, my mother's voice was as sweet as if nothing had happened. "Claire, darling, we're having a family dinner this Saturday. Emily and Jake will be back from their honeymoon, and it would mean the world to us if you and David came." There was no apology in her tone, no acknowledgement of the spectacle they had made at the wedding. Just a summons, as though we were pieces on a board they could move back into place. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Perhaps I was still clinging to a fragile hope that they might explain themselves, even regret the way they had humiliated me. David frowned when I told him. "You don't owe them this," he reminded me, but I insisted. "I need to see for myself." That Saturday, we drove to the house that was no longer my parents' but Emily's. My chest tightened as we pulled into the driveway, and I saw her car parked where mine had once sat. My parents' old sedan was there too, looking out of place now that the house was painted with Emily's tastes. When my mother opened the door, she was radiant, her smile wide and warm as if nothing had fractured between us. She hugged me quickly, then turned the same effusive energy on David. Inside, I noticed the details. New curtains, different rugs, pictures of Emily and Jake already on the walls. She had wasted no time in staking her claim. We moved into the dining room where my father and Jake were watching a game. Emily stood on a chair, fussing with yet another set of decorations. She hopped down and beamed as if she were hosting royalty, not the sister she had just helped betray. We sat down to my mother's pot roast, the food rich with the scent of familiarity that now only made me feel sick. For the first 20 minutes, conversation hovered on their honeymoon, endless stories of beaches and cocktails. I forced myself to nod, to hum politely, though every word scraped against me. Then, as the plates began to empty, my mother cleared her throat. "There's something we want to talk to you about, Claire," she began, her voice calm, almost rehearsed. My father set his fork down and folded his hands, his expression solemn, as though they were about to deliver news that was both inevitable and benevolent. "We've been thinking," he said slowly, "now that Emily and Jake are settled here, they need their privacy. It's their home, after all." The words hit like stones, and I gripped my fork harder to keep my face still. My mother picked up smoothly. "And since they need their space, we've decided it makes the most sense for us to move into your vacation home. It's perfect for us, quiet, comfortable, and you don't use it very often anyway." The audacity of it left me momentarily speechless. They spoke as though the decision was already made, as though my home was theirs to claim. I set my fork down carefully and asked, keeping my voice low, "You've decided you're going to move into my house?" "Yes," my father said firmly, leaning forward as if he expected me to understand. "Where else should we go? We gave this house to Emily. They're newlyweds. They deserve privacy. It's only logical. Before I could respond, Emily leaned back in her chair with a smug little smile. Honestly, Claire, it's not such a big deal. You already have everything you need. You've always been jealous that Mom and Dad love me more, and this just proves it, doesn't it? That's why you're so upset. The words struck with a cruelty that was deliberate. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt, but then something inside me steadied. I turned to her, my voice calm and precise, each word clipped like glass. If Mom and Dad love you so much, Emily, then why don't you let them move in with you? This is a 4-bedroom house, isn't it? Plenty of space. Her smirk faltered. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly finding interest in his plate. My mother gasped softly. My father frowned deeply, but no one rushed to defend Emily. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, the weight of truth settling on all of us. I sat back in my chair, my heartbeat steady now, my anger cooling into something sharper. For years, I had swallowed their favoritism, their constant belittling, their endless excuses. But tonight, for the first time, I gave it back to them with a clarity they could not ignore. Emily's eyes darted away, her fingers tightening around her napkin, and for the first time in a long time, I saw her without the shield of our parents' affection. She looked small, cornered. David reached under the table and took my hand, his squeeze a quiet confirmation that I had finally turned the tide. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth was enough, spoken simply and plainly, to unravel the smugness that had hung over this family for so long. And though the night was far from over, though I knew more battles loomed ahead, I sat taller in my chair, knowing I had drawn the first line they could not cross without consequence. When dinner finally ended, I felt drained but oddly steady. My parents had done their best to twist logic into obligation. Emily had tried to stab with her words, and yet for once I had answered back in a way none of them could ignore. David and I excused ourselves with polite smiles, and as my mother fussed at the doorway about leftovers and seeing us again soon, I tried to keep my composure. I wanted nothing more than to get out of that house and into the quiet of our car. As we were leaving, my father stepped into the hall to fetch his jacket. He was flustered, moving too quickly, muttering under his breath. In his rush, he dropped a leather folder he must have carried with him. It landed near the small console table by the door. He didn't notice. His mind was on saying a last goodbye to David and hustling us out. When the door closed behind us, and I glanced back through the side window, I saw the folder still there, tucked in the shadows. Something made me pause. A half-hour later, after David and I returned home, I realized I had taken the folder with me, almost without thinking. My father's initials were stamped in the corner. Guilt tugged at me, but curiosity overpowered it. I sat down at the kitchen table, hands trembling, and opened the flap. The first pages were routine financial documents, the kind of dry paperwork that always made me glaze over. But then I saw it, a legal agreement, thick with notarized stamps and signatures. My eyes caught the title, Property Transfer of Deed. My pulse pounded as I scanned down the lines. It was the deed to my parents' house. The very house I had been paying the mortgage on faithfully for 5 long years. Only the names listed were not mine. The transferees were Emily and Jake. The date hit me like a physical blow. The contract had been signed months before the wedding. My breath caught as I flipped through the notarization stamps, the signatures neat and bold. My mother's, my father's, Emily's, even Jake's. They had all known. For months, they had been arranging this transfer in secret while I continued to shoulder every payment, believing their promise that one day the house would be mine. I pressed a hand to my mouth as nausea surged. My father had looked me in the eyes more times than I could count, thanking me for helping them keep the house afloat, promising that my sacrifice was building my future. My mother had sent little notes of gratitude, telling me I was such a blessing, that I would be rewarded one day. And all the while, they already knew the house was gone, signed away. Handed to Emily long before I ever walked into that reception hall. The memory of their announcement at the wedding twisted inside me now like a knife. The applause, the tears, the proud smiles they had been performing. It hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment gift, a decision made in a rush of parental affection. It had been calculated, planned, executed in secret. The betrayal deepened, turning from raw hurt into something sharper, darker. They hadn't just favored Emily. They had lied to me. They had used me. For 5 years, I had been nothing more than their puppet, pulling the strings of their debt while they smiled and plotted behind my back. David returned from the bedroom and froze when he saw me hunched over the folder, my hands shaking. "Claire, what is it?" he asked. I pushed the papers toward him. His eyes scanned them quickly, his jaw tightening with each page. "My God," he whispered. "They knew. All this time, they knew." I nodded, unable to speak. Tears blurred the words on the page, but I forced myself to keep looking, to sear the truth into my memory. Every line was a confirmation of the lie I had been living under. Every stamp was proof of how little my trust had meant to them. David sat down across from me, his voice low but brimming with fury. "They didn't just betray you, Claire. They defrauded you. You've been paying for a house that was never going to be yours. They've stolen years of your life, your money, your faith, and Emily, she's been in on it the whole time." The weight of his words settled heavily between us. I thought of the smug look on Emily's face that night at dinner, the casual cruelty of her remark about jealousy, the way she had basked in their affection at the wedding. She had never once flinched, because she had known from the start. She hadn't just accepted the favoritism. She had been a co-conspirator. I sat back in my chair, numb, the folder still open like a wound on the table. The house I thought was my future had been stripped from me long ago, and I had been left in the dark, a fool clinging to empty promises. Something inside me hardened then. The sorrow that had consumed me over the past weeks began to shift, burned away by something stronger. Rage, yes, but also clarity. I wiped my face, closed the folder, and looked at David. "They've been lying to me for years," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "They thought I'd never find out. They thought they could keep taking from me until there was nothing left. But they were wrong." David leaned forward, his hand covering mine. "So what are you going to do?" I stared down at the signatures, at Emily's smug scrawl alongside my parents', and felt the answer crystallize. "I'm done crying. It's time they learn what it feels like to lose." The folder with the deed transfer never left my mind. For days after discovering it, I carried a simmering weight in my chest, a mixture of grief and fury that refused to loosen its grip. David and I spoke often about what it meant, what we should do, how far we were willing to take this fight. He wanted me to be prepared for the possibility that my parents and Emily would not stop pressing, that their entitlement would only grow bolder. I told him I already knew. Deep down, I sensed the storm wasn't finished. That storm broke on a Thursday evening, just as I was shutting down my laptop after a long day at work. My phone buzzed with an alert from the security company. "Motion detected. Front door forced entry." At once, my heart pounded so hard I thought it might split my ribs. The location, my vacation home, the one property that was mine and mine alone, bought with years of overtime shifts and sacrifices no one in my family had ever bothered to see. I opened the app and saw the live feed from the front camera. There they were, my parents lugging suitcases inside, like they owned the place. The security company called seconds later. I confirmed it. "Unauthorized entry. Send police immediately." David was already grabbing his keys before I hung up. "We're going," he said firmly. The drive felt endless, headlights carving through the dark as my chest burned with disbelief and rage. After all the betrayals, the public humiliation, the lies I had told them no. And still they came, key in hand, like parasites determined to take what wasn't theirs. When we pulled into the gravel drive, red and blue lights cut through the night. A police cruiser idled near the porch. 2 officers stood talking to my parents, who were seated on the steps with their luggage scattered like they had been caught mid-move. My father rose when he saw us, his face twisted with indignation rather than shame. My mother's eyes were wet, but her chin lifted defiantly. "Claire," my father barked as I approached. "Finally, tell these officers to stand down. This is all a misunderstanding." I kept walking, my arms stiff at my sides, until I stood just beyond the line of the officers. One of them nodded to me. "Ma'am, they claim this is their residence, but we were told the deed is in your name. Can you confirm?" Before I could answer, my mother shot to her feet. Her voice rose shrill in the night air. "You owe us, Claire. Without us, you'd be nothing. We raised you, we sacrificed for you, and this is how you repay us? By turning us out like dogs?" The old guilt their words once evoked didn't land anymore. Not tonight. I felt David step forward beside me, his presence steady and unwavering. He held a folder in his hand, one we had brought intentionally. Without a word, he opened it and handed the papers to the nearest officer. "This," he said clearly, his voice cutting through the chaos, "is the deed for this property. It belongs solely to my wife, Claire. No one else's name is on it. What you're seeing here is trespassing. Pure and simple." My father's face flushed crimson. "Trespassing?" He spat. "We're her parents. That house wouldn't even exist if not for us. We gave her life. David didn't flinch. He stepped closer, meeting my father's glare without a shred of fear. "You've mistaken giving life for owning it. This house is not yours. It never was. You broke in, and now you have two choices: leave or face charges." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by my mother's quick, ragged breathing. For once, Emily wasn't there to shield them, to gloat or manipulate. They were exposed, caught red-handed. My mother's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. My father clenched his fists, then dropped them uselessly to his sides. The officer scanned the documents, then turned to me. "It's clear enough. Do you wish to press charges, ma'am?" I looked at my parents standing there in the flashing lights, their luggage piled high, their dignity unraveling before my eyes. Part of me wanted to say yes, to let the law crush them the way they had tried to crush me. Another part, quieter but still present, recoiled from the idea of seeing them hauled away in handcuffs. After everything, they were still my parents. "No," I said finally, my voice low but unwavering. "I don't want them jailed, but I do want them gone. Tonight." The officers nodded. "Understood. We'll escort them off the property. If they return without permission, we'll have grounds for arrest." David's hand found mine again, warm and steady, as the officers guided my parents toward the cruiser. My mother turned once, her eyes wild, her voice breaking as she cried, "Claire, you'll regret this. Blood is blood. Family is forever." I stood straight, my jaw tight, and let the words wash over me without response. Because for the first time in my life, I understood. Family isn't forever when it feeds on betrayal. Family isn't forever when it tries to strip you bare and call it love. As the cruiser pulled away, David squeezed my hand once more. "It's over," he murmured. I watched the taillights disappear down the road and shook my head. "No," I said softly. "It's just beginning." The flashing lights from the police cruiser painted the gravel drive in streaks of red and blue, and I stood rooted in place as the officers gathered my parents' luggage. Each suitcase was set down beside them with deliberate care, as though marking the end of their attempted occupation. My father shifted from foot to foot, his face a storm of pride and humiliation, while my mother hunched over, clutching her handbag as though it could protect her from the reality unfolding around her. One officer stepped forward. "We're going to take them in for a few hours. No charges are being filed, but they'll receive a formal warning about trespassing. If this happens again, it won't be a warning next time." His eyes flicked to me, sharp and steady. "Do you understand, ma'am?" "I do," I said quietly, but my voice carried the iron I felt rising inside me. The officers motioned for my parents to stand. My father scoffed and muttered, "This is absurd. We're not criminals." But he rose anyway, grabbing the handle of his suitcase. My mother followed more slowly, her eyes darting to mine, silently pleading. Yet there was no plea I could answer. The line had been crossed, and I was no longer the daughter who would bend under their weight. The cruiser door opened with a metallic clank. My parents shuffled toward it, flanked by the officers. For the first time in my life, I saw them not as figures of authority, not as the untouchable center of our family, but as ordinary people who had finally gone too far. Their power over me had crumbled, replaced by the stark image of two aging figures, boxed in by their own arrogance. My mother paused just before stepping inside. Her voice was ragged. "Claire, please, we're your parents. Don't let them treat us this way." I held her gaze, my heartbeat steady now, and said the words I had carried inside me for years. "This is the line. Never cross it again." The door shut with a finality that echoed louder than her sobs. As the cruiser pulled away, David wrapped his arm around me. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. I nodded, though my chest felt tight. "I needed them to see there are consequences," I murmured. For once, they had to feel what it's like to be powerless. We stayed on the porch until the lights disappeared down the road, the silence returning heavier than before. My parents' luggage still sat on the gravel, abandoned. I arranged for it to be taken to a storage facility later that night, not because I owed them that kindness, but because leaving it there felt like allowing them to linger. I wanted them gone from this place completely. The house was quiet when we finally stepped inside. I ran my hand along the new locks, checked the alarm system again, reassured myself that everything was secure. But the image of my parents being guided into that cruiser replayed in my mind, over and over. It wasn't triumph I felt, but something harder to define: cold justice, perhaps, mixed with the ache of realizing how far a family could fall. David poured 2 glasses of water and set one in front of me. "You did what you had to do. They needed to see that you won't bend anymore." "I know," I said. My voice was calm, but inside, a storm still churned. For years I had carried the burden of being the dutiful daughter, the one who paid the bills, who covered the mistakes, who let the favoritism slide because I believed loyalty would eventually be returned. But tonight, watching them in the back of a police car, I knew that loyalty had been a one-way street. The next morning, a call came from the station. My parents had been released after a few hours. They had been sternly advised not to approach the property again. The officer's tone was careful, but firm, leaving no room for misunderstanding. When I hung up, David caught my eye. "They'll be angry," he said. "Good," I replied. "Let them sit in that anger. Let them choke on it. Maybe it will keep them away." I stepped to the window and stared out at the quiet road leading away from our home. For the first time in years, I felt a boundary drawn in sharp, unbreakable ink. My parents could rage, they could twist their version of events, they could paint themselves as victims, but they would never again have free reign over my life. The line was there. And this time, it was mine to enforce. The silence after my parents' night at the police station did not last long. Barely 3 days had passed when the storm returned in a new form, one they wielded with the precision of practiced manipulators. This time, the battlefield was not my vacation home, but the internet. I woke up to a barrage of notifications on my phone, messages from cousins, coworkers, even an old college friend. Each one linked to the same post. There it was, plastered across Facebook, a long, winding status from my mother. The words dripped with tragedy and self-pity. "Our daughter abandoned us," it began. "In our golden years when we needed love the most, she cast us aside like trash. We sacrificed everything for her, and in return she called the police on her own parents. We are heartbroken, homeless, humiliated. Is this what family has come to?" Hundreds of reactions already lined the post. Crying emojis, comments from relatives far and near, offering prayers and sympathy. "Stay strong," one aunt wrote. "No parent deserves this." Another cousin chimed in. "Claire has always been selfish. I'm not surprised." The tide was swift and ugly, painting me as the villain in a story where they were martyrs. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone trembling in my hand. David rubbed his eyes, reading over my shoulder. "Of course," he muttered, his voice flat with disgust. "They couldn't accept boundaries, so now they're rewriting history." But just as the weight of humiliation began to settle in my stomach, something remarkable happened. Beneath the sea of sympathetic comments, one stood out, sharp as a blade cutting through lies. A familiar name appeared. Mrs. Caldwell, our old neighbor who had lived across the street for nearly 2 decades. She wrote, "Stop lying. I saw Claire paying your mortgage every month. 5 years. Everyone in the neighborhood knew. Don't you dare pretend you sacrificed for her when she was the one keeping you afloat." The ripple effect was immediate. Replies flooded beneath her comment. Wait, is this true? Claire paid their mortgage? Why didn't they mention that? The sympathy that had been so quick to gather around my parents wavered, then cracked. Like dominoes, other voices chimed in. A family friend admitted remembering how often I dropped off checks. A cousin recalled overhearing my father joke once about having a free ride thanks to me. The narrative shifted in real time before my eyes. David squeezed my shoulder. Now's the time. Tell your side. I nodded, heart racing. Enough was enough. I opened a blank post, and my fingers flew. I've stayed silent for too long, I began, but since my parents have chosen to take this public, here is the truth. Then I laid it bare. How they had begged me to cover their mortgage when finances collapsed, promising, one day, this house will be yours. How I had sacrificed vacations, luxuries, even postponed starting a family, all to make sure they didn't lose their home. How they had turned around and handed that house to Emily as a wedding gift, smiling while I stood in the crowd, blindsided. I wrote about the dinner where they tried to corner me into surrendering my vacation home. I described the night they broke in, dragging their suitcases inside as if they had every right. I explained that the police had intervened not because I was cruel, but because they forced me into that position by crossing every boundary. I ended it simply. Family is built on love and respect. I gave them both. What I will not give is my life, my savings, and my dignity just to be used and discarded. Enough. I hit post before I could lose my nerve. The effect was immediate. Notifications exploded as relatives, coworkers, even old friends began sharing my words. I had no idea, one cousin wrote. You deserved better. Another messaged privately. Claire, I feel sick reading this. Your parents should be ashamed. The tide had turned. Where once I had been painted as selfish, now the light revealed their manipulation for what it was. By evening, my mother's original post had become a battlefield. Half the comments remained supportive, but the other half demanded answers. Why didn't you mention Claire paid the mortgage? Is it true you gave the house to Emily? Why would you try to move into her property without asking? The sympathy they had basked in was unraveling thread by thread, replaced by suspicion, criticism, and shame. David leaned against the doorway, watching me scroll. They wanted the public on their side. They forgot the public likes the truth more than a sob story. I almost smiled, though bitterness lingered. They thought they could control the story, the way they've always controlled me. But not this time. This time, the truth was mine to tell, and I had told it without flinching. For the first time, the weight of their lies wasn't crushing me, it was crushing them. And as I closed my laptop that night, I realized that while they might keep fighting, their power to silence me had been broken forever. The fallout from my post still rippled across the family like a shockwave when another consequence came crashing down, this time at Emily's doorstep. My parents, stripped of sympathy and with nowhere to go, turned to her, clutching their pride as though it could shield them from rejection. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon, bags in hand, standing on her porch like refugees. Emily opened the door, her face a mixture of annoyance and discomfort. Emily, my mother said, her voice trembling with the remnants of self-pity. We need a place to stay, just for a while. Your sister has abandoned us and… Emily cut her off, her tone sharp. This is my house. Jake and I need our privacy. You can't just move in here. My father's face fell, his jaw tightening. We gave you this house. You wouldn't even have it without us. Emily's voice wavered, but she held her ground. Exactly. It's mine now, and we need space. You'll have to figure something else out. The door closed on them, leaving my parents on the porch in stunned silence. It was a scene I never witnessed firsthand, but later heard about through whispers in the family group chat, where sympathy for my parents had begun to dry up. They had created a mess and now found no safe harbor, not even in the daughter they had favored so relentlessly. But karma wasn't finished. A few weeks later, Emily's perfect little world began to crack. It started with a phone call during dinner. She ignored the unknown number at first, but when it rang again, she picked up. The voice on the other end was from the bank, stern and unyielding. The mortgage on the house, the same one I had been paying faithfully for years, was now in arrears. Payments were due, penalties were accruing, and the responsibility rested squarely on her shoulders. Emily's hands shook as she ended the call. She had thought the house was a clean gift, tied up with a bow, her prize for being the golden child. She hadn't understood, or hadn't cared, that the debt attached to it was as real as the walls she had redecorated with new curtains. The home wasn't the carefree inheritance she had imagined. It was a burden she had never been prepared to carry. When she finally came to me, it was with tears streaking her face and desperation thick in her voice. She cornered me after work one evening, waiting outside my office like a shadow. "Claire, please," she begged, clutching my arm. "The bank keeps calling. I don't know what to do. They say I'll lose the house if I don't make the payments. You know how this works. You've done it before. Please, help me. Just until I figure things out." Her sobs echoed in the parking lot, but my heart remained stone. I looked at her, my sister, who had stood smiling as our parents handed her the house I had paid for, who had mocked me at the dinner table, telling me I was jealous, who had turned away our parents when their desperation no longer served her. And now, here she was, finally feeling the weight I had carried alone for half a decade. "Ask Mom and Dad," I said coldly, my voice steady, my eyes unflinching. "They promised you everything, remember?" Emily froze, her mouth half open, the plea caught in her throat. For once, she had no clever retort, no smug assurance that she was the favorite. She simply broke down, sobbing harder, while I stepped past her toward my car. David was waiting inside, watching the scene unfold through the window. As I slid into the seat, he asked softly, "Did you tell her?" "Yes," I replied. "I told her the truth she didn't want to hear." He nodded, his hand finding mine. "That's not cruelty, Claire. That's justice." I leaned back in the seat, the weight of years lifting slowly from my shoulders. For so long, I had been the one sacrificing, the one holding everything together while they treated me as if I didn't matter. Now the tables had turned. My parents sat in a shabby rental they could barely afford. Emily faced the very debt I had once carried for her benefit. And me? I was finally free, no longer bound by promises broken or by chains of guilt. As we drove away, Emily's sobs faded into the distance. I felt no triumph, only a quiet, hard-earned peace. Karma had done the work I no longer needed to do. The silence that followed Emily's desperate plea was almost unsettling. For weeks there had been no calls, no sudden appearances, no angry confrontations. My parents had faded into the background, and Emily had vanished into her own spiral of debt and shame. For the first time in years, my life was calm. David and I went about our routines, enjoying dinners together, talking about trips we might take, imagining a future not weighed down by constant manipulation. It felt like healing, slow and steady. Then one evening, as I folded laundry in our bedroom, my phone lit up. The caller ID made my heart pause for a beat. "Mom." I let it ring. I wasn't ready. And truthfully, I doubted I ever would be. But then the phone buzzed again, voicemail. I hesitated, staring at it on the nightstand. Curiosity won. I pressed play. At first, her voice was shaky, almost unrecognizable. "Claire," she began softly. "We're sorry. We need you. We've made mistakes, and we miss you. Please, call us back. Your father isn't well. We can't do this without you." For a brief moment, I felt something stir in me. A memory of her hands braiding my hair when I was a child, her voice calling me in for dinner, the faint warmth of a mother's love I had always longed for. My throat tightened. Could this be real? Could they finally understand what they had done? But then, her tone shifted. The tremor in her voice hardened, replaced by something cold and familiar. "And don't forget, you owe us. Without us, you wouldn't even exist. Everything you have, everything you are, started with us. Don't you dare turn your back on family." I froze. The spell shattered instantly. The apology, the weakness, it had all been a prelude, a trap. Beneath the surface, nothing had changed. They were still the same people who saw me as a resource, a tool, a daughter only when convenient. They hadn't called to make peace. They had called to remind me of their claim, their endless entitlement. David walked into the room, catching the look on my face. "What happened?" he asked gently. I handed him the phone. He listened in silence, his jaw tightening as the message played. When it ended, he set the phone down, his eyes steady on mine. "They haven't changed. They never will." I nodded, the last trace of doubt evaporating. For years, I had clung to hope that if I worked hard enough, gave enough, loved enough, I would finally earn their respect, their care, their approval. But the voicemail was the final proof I needed. They weren't capable of it. That weekend, I drove out to my vacation home one last time. The quiet air felt different, lighter, as if even the walls had been holding their breath through all the chaos. I walked through each room, letting my hand graze the surfaces, remembering the times I had come here for solitude. This place had always been my refuge, my sanctuary, and now it was time to make sure it could never again be a pawn in their schemes. I called a rental agency that afternoon. By Monday, the listing was up. It would no longer sit empty, vulnerable to trespass and entitlement. It would generate income, managed on my terms, untouchable by anyone else. It was more than a practical decision. It was symbolic. A declaration that my life, my choices, my property, belonged to me alone. As I signed the papers, David squeezed my hand. "Are you sure?" he asked. I met his eyes. "Yes. I'm done letting them write the story. This time, I'm holding the pen." Driving away from the house, I felt no sorrow, no regret. Only a profound sense of clarity. My parents could cling to their twisted justifications. Emily could wallow in the weight of the gift she had so eagerly accepted, but I no longer carried any of it. That night, as I turned off my phone to avoid the inevitable barrage of missed calls, I whispered the words that had eluded me my entire life. For the first time in my life, I chose me. And this time, I meant it. And that was the moment my story reached its end, not with a reunion or forgiveness, but with a choice, my choice to finally step out of the shadow of broken promises and live on my own terms. I know many of you watching have faced betrayals that cut deep, moments where family became the very people who hurt you the most. Tell me, if you were in my shoes, what would you have done? Would you have given them another chance? Or would you have drawn the line as I did? I want to hear your thoughts, because every story like this has more than one side, and your voice matters. If this story struck a chord with you, if it made you angry, if it made you cheer when I finally said no, then don't forget to subscribe for more stories just like this. Share your perspective in the comments. Was this revenge? Was it justice? Or simply survival? Your words keep these stories alive, and together we create a place where truth is told, no matter how painful.